Because it says it's streaming.
Yeah,
Perfect.
we're live. I can see us.
Okay, I see it.
Okay, cool.
Awesome.
All
Yeah,
right.
thanks everyone for being here today. This is a really, really exciting talk. Everyone who's in the Zoom room, if you could please just mute your microphone when somebody is speaking, helps us prevent little hiccups and stuff like that. So yeah, we are here today with three wonderful psychedelic, two historians and one ethnobotanist. They have all dedicated a lot of their life to uncovering some really, really interesting findings about different plants and cultures. So yeah, we're just going to spend a little bit of time talking about different religions and cultures in regards to ancient psychoactive plants. I'm not going to go too deep into the introductions because I assume if you're watching, you probably already know who these people are. But I'll give you a little background. So we have Chris Bennett with us. Chris has been researching the historical role of cannabis in the spiritual life of humanity for more than half a century. He's been recognized by major international media labels and has written many informative books on cannabis and psychedelics. We also have Tom here today. Tom Hatsis is a psychedelic historian, he's an author and a lecturer. He runs a nonprofit called Psanctum Psychedelia with his partner Eden in Portland, Oregon. And last but not least, we of course have Dennis McKenna here. He's a well-known figure in the psychedelic community. His primary area of interest is in the interdisciplinary study of Amazonian ethnobotany. So what I'm going to start out with is a question for Dennis. If indeed psychoactive plants were central to religious rituals worldwide, why do you suppose they've been so demonized lately?
Well, that's not an easy question. I think that, first of all, I have to say, Chris and Tom have far more expertise in this area. I feel like I'm here to learn and listen as much as anything. But I think on a general in a general way, I think that as religions become institutionalized, they become ossified and rigidified. As dogma takes over from practice, the first thing they do is exorcise the central mystery of their practices, right? In that certain sense, we can't actually tolerate people having real mystical experiences in which the priesthood and the hierarchy does not intervene. That's for the hierarchy to dispense as they wish. So it's a political move, essentially. The sort of diffusing of these incredible personal experiences tend to be disruptive to institutions. They are inherently disruptive to institutions because they make us question things. So I think that's the reason. I think that and you see this in the church, as the patriarchy took over, these mysteries were suppressed. Whether you believe with Brian or some of the others, I'm not saying, but that's a general pattern. So I'll leave it there in the interest of brevity, which Tom rightly cautioned us about.
Yeah, that's great. I think it's a good time to just come together and communicate about this because it was so long ago, Soma, for example, I don't know if anyone really knows what was in it, but it's fascinating to have different scholars come together and share what they know. So I'm hoping that that's kind of where this goes is, respectful dialogue of sharing our findings. And I am absolutely no expert in any of this. I'm just very curious. So yeah, I'm grateful to be here talking to you all. So Chris, why do you think this is a subject of such importance in today's day and age in regards to religion and psychoactive plants? And why have you spent so much of your life studying this?
Oh, I think this is the paradigm shift that we've been waiting for. It's humanity's separation from the natural world that's really at the core of the problems we're facing today. Global warming, the climate change that's going on, all that type of stuff, and even the new diseases, all that type of stuff is due to human interactions and our inability to fit in with the natural world. And one of the things we notice about cultures that still do use these substances, they've not been banned everywhere. You know what I mean? There were living traditions in South America and Africa and other places. Is their deep connection to nature? You take mushrooms, you walk in the forest, and it becomes a living entity. And these plants are like the ambassadors of Gaia, inviting us back into Eden. And it's interesting because it's you were talking about the beginning of religion, and it's like what we're discovering is the plant-based shamanic origins of religion itself, these same religions that became fossilized and solidified in the way that Dennis was talking about, became handbooks for rules and moved away from the experiential. And this has led us to this point here. It's those same plants that are the gateway back to Eden, back to the natural world. And they're giving us that chance. This is Gaia offering her hand to us, giving us that chance to get back onto planet Earth, back onto the mothership.
Could I throw a little bit of nuance into this real quick?
No.
Absolutely, please do.
One of the things that I've noticed in my years of research is the way that this kind of blanket idea of okay, this institution comes to power, this institution now demonizes these substances, doesn't actually pan out when you get into like medieval sourced records. As just one example, by the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries, that's when the Catholic Church had become quite ironically a Goliath, but there was no problem at all with people using these psychoactives, and in fact, it was openly encouraged. Many writers did. In fact, the first great Christian apologist, Origen, was more than happy to recommend using mandrake. In fact, Thomas Aquinas even wrote about trying mandrake. Theodoret of Syria liked to smoke opium and then read from the Gospels. So, an institution can be solidified and not necessarily reject psychedelia. One last example, during the 1950s, Christians were pretty gung-ho about taking LSD. So again, there's what we have to figure out. I think that there's a different answer or perhaps a more nuanced answer than just, oh, the institution has coalesced, so now they're going to destroy the plants, because historically, that's not always what happens, and certainly didn't happen in ancient pagan days. I mean, the Roman state was enormous, and they actively, used these entheogens in their rites. So,
Do you think?
I just want to add in there too, like we're talking about vast lengths of time here and vast areas. You know what I mean? And even in Catholicism, different periods. If you're talking like take a 500-year stretch and all of Europe. Different things are happening in different areas and stuff. It takes a while. Like, the prohibitions of early Judaism, stuff like that, they've been forgotten by the time of the Catholics, you know what I mean? So there's like a whole vast area of there. And same with the LSD stuff. This was something new to them. You know what I mean? It hadn't been, the morality hadn't been placed on it in the same way.
Oh, of course. And that's what that's exactly my point, is that it's not this morality that we all, that is placed on these plants that we all disagree with, or at least the moralizing of them. All that stuff was in place, and yet the moralizing didn't come. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. So it's just something to think about. I don't want to send us over the guardrail though.
Isn't it possible though? I mean, I think you point out that the use of these things was encouraged in the early stages of Christianity, and there wasn't such prohibition, but only later they came to be sort of stigmatized and seen as having coming from the devil and this sort of thing. So what shifted, I guess, is my question. What changed?
Yeah.
I mean, I would want it seems to me one of the factors with this has to be that Christianity is very invested, it seems, in the denial of biology, essentially. All the effort that was made with the ascetics to suppress sexuality, and sexuality is just one corner of the triangle that sort of makes up, what life is really all about, which is sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And the early, Christianity doesn't like any of those things. So maybe it has something to do with this. The ascetics went to great lengths to suppress their urges, essentially, and the urge to engage in sex is one of those, but the urge to alter consciousness, is also part of this. And I think in some ways Christianity viewed that as forbidden territory, at least for the lay people. Maybe for the priests it was okay.
It's interesting, you talk about sex, rock and roll, and Christianity, because in the first few centuries, it was sex, rock and roll. And there's explicit references to Gnostic sex cults, and they definitely, had a kind of a tantric view of sexuality that's kind of closer to the East. And there's also, texts that both Tom and I and Brian have discussed that reveal entheogenic use in early Christianity as well, infused wines and indications of psychoactive incense and other things. And these are direct references in Gnostic texts. And, the Roman Catholic Church, it's like definitely, didn't want those other sects existing anymore, and it does seem to be kind of a darkening point both for Gnostic Christianity and pagan cults that also use these types of substances in ancient Rome and Greece and other areas, and a transition point. But by the time Tom's talking about the medieval period, it's like 700 years, 800 years have gone by in that intervening period, and a lot of that stuff's just all forgotten. It takes them a while to kind of figure it out, but definitely things like everywhere it says sorcery in the New Testament, it's a translation of a Greek word, pharmakia, and this makes direct reference to plant-based magic, and shamanism and that type of thing. So it was definitely in there when they went looking for it. But, there was definitely, as Tom says, there was medical use of a lot of these substances as well.
Yeah, and Origen, for point of clarification, Origen was writing in the 2nd century, and he was pretty enthusiastic about using things like mandrake. So again, it comes and goes at different times and places. I would caution us all to not lump any religion or any kind of identifiable group as this monolithic thing that once it forms, it stays that way, when I think we all know that these things do change over time.
Right, that's true.
Could you describe mandrake a bit, Tom? Like its usage and
Sure,
what people were associated with it?
Sure. Mandrake is one of the most, at least in the ancient and medieval worlds, it was one of the most popular entheogenic substances that people would use. Opium being on the top of that list as well. So mandrake and opium were the two biggies. You get cannabis and henbane as well. But with mandrake, like all solanaceous plants, is dose dependent. So small doses of it, about a gram or so, you'll get a little kind of a drunk feeling. 2 grams and a little bit more, 2.5 grams, that's where you start getting the visuals. Upping it to 3, you start to kind of, they say, causes frenzy, but what they're talking about is enthusiasmos, meaning religious intoxication. And up to 4 grams, it kills you or puts you in a coma and then kills you. But people used it for all kinds of reasons, medicinally, of course, and entheogenically. My first book, The Witches Ointment, deals a lot with that, how people used mandrake to contact the goddess, and how that practice was eventually seen as demonic.
Right, and I think it bears pointing out, as you probably have, Tom, somewhere, these solanaceous plants are not psychedelics in the strict sense. I mean, they profoundly alter consciousness, but they do not have the same kind of phenomenology that what I sometimes call the true psychedelics, the ones that hit the serotonin 2A receptors, kind of by definition,
Sure.
as a way of separating it from all the other psychoactive plants and so on. You can designate those true psychedelics. Henbane, mandrake, Brugmansia, all of these are solanaceous, and they produce a different kind of state of consciousness. Not that it's not profoundly an altered state, but it's more like a kind of a delirium in a sense. I sometimes tell people, sometimes in my classes, I say, the solanaceous plants are true hallucinogens, but not true psychedelics.
So then let's call it entheogenic, because I agree with you totally that, psychedelic. So let's call it entheogenic instead, because when you read the reports, especially like reading the reports of women accused of witchcraft, they were absolutely using this stuff in ways that we today would call entheogenic. Obviously, the word didn't exist back then, but when you read the reports, I mean, that's what they're talking about. So I would agree that maybe entheogenic is a better, more precise term than psychedelic for the solanaceous plants.
Yeah,
what the fuck is going on? I'm so sorry.
Somebody's. Yeah, I think it's a good point, Tom. I'm not crazy about the word entheogenic either, but we don't have to go down that path right now. I mean, it will do for now. There are reasons that I have not to use that, but in this context, I think that's legitimate, because entheogenic, you're saying this is a psychoactive substance used in a religious context for a religious experience and a spiritual experience, and that's fine, within the limits. I'm not gonna go to the mat with you on this.
Oh no.
Because everybody uses it, and that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to use psychedelic as a general term that just means mind manifesting, as everybody in the room knows. So it's like, it's at that level where it's like, okay, can cannabis be psychedelic? Well, I think it is personally. So did Alan Watts. In fact, after Alan Watts took LSD the first time, he said that cannabis was far better for getting into that state of, that mystical state of awareness than LSD. Now, he eventually changed his mind, but I still thought it was interesting that he was throwing in for cannabis over LSD.
Right.
I'd pipe in there and say that, cannabis historically is the most widely used entheogen in history, and that can be documented as such. Opium. And you can find clear evidence of cannabis use in ancient Judaism. We have the archaeological evidence now, as well as the etymological case for cannabosum. There's clear references in Tibetan Buddhism to cannabis, datura, and other henbane, other substances like that, in 10th and 11th century manuscripts. The relationship in India with Shiva and Kali, undeniable. Ancient Zoroastrian references to banga, which is cannabis. The list goes on, as well as the recent evidence out of China at burial sites and its role in Indo-European burials. So for sure, like that, those are like clear, solid pieces of evidence of entheogenic use of a substance. And I don't think anything else, not that I, disagree with their power and their potency, I don't think anything else can muster the legitimacy of the solid proof of cannabis's role as an entheogen in history.
But opium, I agree with you, Chris, on cannabis being widespread, but opium is right up there, and so is mandrake. I mean, there are plenty of references to them, no?
Take a look around the world today and show me some, religious opium use, religious mandrake use.
I thought we were talking about the ancient world.
We're talking about, Zoroastrianism, for instance, the cannabis-infused wines in Zoroastrianism, or the evidence in Judaism of being burnt in the temple, or the temple that Serenity found in the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex.
But that had cannabis and
evidence of opium on that level.
But Serenity had cannabis and opium and ephedra, no?
Absolutely true. That's true. Yeah, but it was only a little bit of opium. It was lots of cannabis and ephedra. There's 3 temple sites. One of them had opium at it. I'm not disputing there was opium use. I just don't think it's on the level of the evidence of cannabis use for spiritual purposes. Medically, I would say more so as a pain reliever and things like that.
Sure. And then there's all the stuff that we don't even know what they were talking about in the ancient world, like Gilatophilus and Hysteriatus and Thesigal. Like, how do you pronounce it, Bennett? Theangles.
I read these words, I can't say them.
Theangles, like Andromechus. Like, we don't know what any of those things are, but they're all listed as having what's, for lack of a better, mind manifesting properties to them, and being used by Persian magi specifically for prophecy, as Pliny says. So, and we don't even know, like, we don't know what Gilatophilus is. We just know that the magi used it to induce visions. So it's like there's not just the big four, as Bennett and what I would call cannabis, opium, mandrake, and henbane. There's all these other things that we don't even know what the hell they were. Hurrian look is another one.
Yeah, not to say that nothing else was, these other mushrooms, these types of things were not used. We just don't have the archaeological and the clear identification of these substances in the ancient texts. Sure. But there are substances that we don't know that are clearly psychoactive, as Tom points out.
I think we should talk a little bit about soma, because I know that Chris has done extensive research into this. And I know Terrence, Dennis's brother, has also done a little bit of research. So yeah, it'd be super interesting to hear both of your views and talk a little bit about that.
Well, I wrote a book, Cannabis and the Soma Solution, in 2010. And I've got articles online about, why I think that cannabis and ephedra are the best case, and why I think that things like Watson's identification of mushrooms should be dissuaded. I'm going to have to probably go a little bit over Tom's time limit here.
Take my time. I don't know shit about soma, so take my time.
The real quick breakdown of why I think that cannabis is the best case scenario. Well, the use of soma begins with what's known as the Indo-European tribes, the Vedas and the Avesta, where we have Haoma, the counterpart of soma in the Persian world, were both written in Indo-European tongues. Indo-European is the mother tongue of most of our modern languages, at least European languages, English, French, German. And that's why there's interrelation between all the cannabis words, because they originate with this earlier Indo-European word. And ritually, we know that the Indo-Europeans have been using cannabis for a very long time. We have evidence from Romania and Ukraine of cannabis being burnt at burial sites from 5,500 years ago, 5,000 years ago. And we can see this practice continued at Scythian sites well into the early centuries AD, and going as far back at Scythian sites as like 500-600 BC. And the Scythians both burned cannabis in braziers, but they also drank infusions of it. We have archaeological evidence of both of these types of things. We have braziers where cannabis was burnt, and we have golden goblets where opium and cannabis were drunk, mixed together. It's important to remember that these Scythians, one of the names that certain groups of them were known by was Haoma Varga, the Haoma gatherers, and they are specifically accused of burning Haoma as well as drinking it. So this fits with the archaeological evidence there. We also have evidence of the same ritual use taking place in China at Indo-European sites in China. And Indo-European groups were in China from about 2000 BC to 400 BC. And it's likely here that they picked up the term from the Chinese huma, which means Scythian cannabis or fire cannabis, and refers specifically to the psychoactive varieties of cannabis. And linguist Mandy Hassan in the 1980s, he suggested that Scythian barbarians picked up this terminology and ritual use and brought this into the Bactria margiana region as Huma, and that's became Haoma. Now, after this time period, when Mandy Hassan discovered this, we found out there was a whole culture of Indo-Europeans there growing and utilizing cannabis. And resin-containing cannabis has been found at their burial sites as well as tools for burning it. So the linguistic theory is pretty strong for huma being adopted by Indo-European tribes. Then we go into the Bactria margiana archaeological complex via the Scythian, who are the Haoma Varga. And at this site, we know that at this site, there was trade between the people in China and the Bactria margiana archaeological complex, where the Russian archaeologist Victor Sarianetti claimed to have found soma temples where cannabis ephedra and opium were used. And they also found ephedra at these Chinese sites. So both of these plants could have come into this region. And then through further linguistic changes, Hayoma becomes soma as it goes into Indian. There's a lot more to it than that, but that's the main points of the archaeology and the linguistic case for it.
It's quite fascinating too, because like you say, there's all this archaeological evidence coming out these days about finding plants in temples and whatnot. Do you think that we'll ever know what was in it for sure? Like, the thing that I think about too is someone from way back then probably has such a very different outlook on life than we do here now, you know? So how does one like read those texts and decipher truth from it? It's just fascinating.
I should point out that we're talking about, again, vast periods of time here, and substitutions did come into play, and they wrote about these substitutions and different things. And in a lot of ways, it became a situation where the plants used were blessed by the Vedic priests and became the Eucharistic soma. So I'm talking about the origins of it when I'm talking about that. But, you know, a lot happened in that time period. It takes a lot more than I can give here to explain that.
Do you have similar views on this, Tom, or?
I'd actually be more interested to hear Dennis's views, because soma is an area that is very much outside of my research. I focus mostly on Western civilization, the areas around the Mediterranean. So this is a little too far east for me. So I'd like to default to Dennis.
Yeah, let's hear.
Well, all right. So you're kind of putting me on the spot, and
sorry.
That's okay. I actually, and I don't consider myself a soma scholar, or really a scholar in any of these areas that you guys have spent so much more time studying. I guess I'm a kind of dilettante, but I have never been comfortable with Wasson's case that Amanita muscaria was soma. You know, I mean, it doesn't pass the smell test in a certain sense. And my biggest problem with it is actually pharmacology. He is talking about a entheogen. We'll use that word provisionally for now. We're all agreed that we're going to use that. He's talking about an entheogen that from the Vedic texts indicates a transcendent, completely transformative experience, a psychedelic experience along the classic lines of a high-dose psilocybin experience, which will, reliably induce what you might call a mystical experience, mystical insights. Amanita muscaria does not reliably do that, as far as I know, because for one thing, it's not serotonergic. It works on the GABA receptors, and muscimol and ibotenic acid are GABA agonists. So the GABA receptors are the same receptors that alcohol works on, for example, and things like kava and actually benzodiazepine type tranquilizers. So from the pharmacological point of view, Amanita muscaria is not capable of producing a transcendent psychedelic experience. I mean, there may be people here I don't want to, I hesitate to assert that definitely, because there's probably people in the audience who would strongly disagree. And I have heard stories that there are perhaps ways to modify the preparation that make it quite a different preparation. But as far as I know, the GABA experience is more like a cheap drunk than a psychedelic experience, and it bears much resemblance to that. So on that level, I have a problem with soma being Amanita muscaria. Terence speculated that, of course, that soma was actually a psilocybin mushroom, probably Psilocybe cubensis. He didn't make a strong case for that. He just mentioned it in passing. I'm not sure it's possible to make a strong case for it. For one thing, the geography of it is a problem. Psilocybe cubensis is a tropical pan-tropical mushroom. Soma, supposedly it came originally from the forests. So I think it is open for discussion. I think nobody really knows, but I'm uncomfortable with with Wasson's assertion. I mean, in order to make that assertion, he had to ignore a lot. And I think the same is true in many of these things. One point that Wasson made, which he kind of leaned on, and I wonder if Chris would like to address this, was that he talks about the characteristics of soma, its color, etc. And he says it has no leaves. And so, and by saying that, he's able to dismiss a whole number of things. You might get away with that with ephedra. Maybe ephedra in some ways has no leaves. Cannabis definitely has leaves. So I wonder if Chris might want to comment on
yeah,
that.
no, one of the things that Wasson did is he left out the whole 10th mandala of the Rig Veda, and the 10th
Oh, well,
mandala,
that was convenient.
Yeah, right.
the actual descriptions of the plant. It describes it as a green and purple tree.
Uh-huh.
Now, it does describe branches and things like that. There is, different Vedic scholars say, like, there's even amongst Vedic scholars, there's different translations of a lot of these different words, right? You know what I mean? Some scholars, and I'm talking about Indian Vedic scholars, say there is references to leaves, and they point to certain words that they say are references to leaves. And the term bhang also appears in the Vedic texts, in reference to the preparation of cannabis, because it's bhang comes from the term bhang because it was ground with rocks. And in the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda, it describes soma as a green and purple tree, and describes the rocks used for preparing soma as their faces being turned green. And because of this, Indologists like Elaine Danilo and A.L. Bashram, they have said this is very similar to the preparation of bhang in India, where it's crushed with rocks, mortar and pestle, or flat rock with a rock, and made into a paste and prepared. And if you take a look at the way that it's prepared, that's another issue. And also, another thing is when the prohibitions of soma were being discussed in the ancient texts, such as the Sapatatha Brahmana, I hope I didn't butcher that pronunciation, they refer specifically to plants. They refer to sana, which is an ancient Sanskrit name in reference to cloth, but in reference to soma, they refer to a term usana, and it's sana with a U in front of it. This is an unknown term, but it's using part of the term for cannabis. You know what I mean? And one of the things that's emerging out of China is, like, recently they've said this is the home of both industrial strains of cannabis and resin strains of cannabis. Industrial strains were first hybridized in China, it's believed now 12,000 years ago. And all industrial strains are relative to these industrial strains from China. And all drug strains are from China from 4,000 years ago. And this coincides with the time the Indo-European Gushi culture, which I'm talking about, also thought to be Tocharian speakers. And this is like Aryan, Tocharian. This is thought to have split off at the same time as the Aryans did from the wider, older Indo-European body as well, right? So yeah, there's definite, that's debatable whether leaves are mentioned or not. Depends which Indian scholar you refer to. And I want to point out that, in India, there's a predominance of researchers that have connected it to cannabis. I don't know of any Indian researchers who've gone with the mushroom theory or even the ephedra theory. I mean, not the ephedra theory, the Syrian root theory. The ephedra is very widely accepted both in Zoroastrianism and in Hinduism as having been in the original Hayom and Soma, and I don't dispute that. And sorry, Tom, I went over your limit.
Oh, no, whatever. We don't have to keep saying that. The one thing I did want to just add to that, with the Amanita muscaria, with all this stuff in history, like Chris, you had correctly pointed out that Wasson left out like the 10th verse of the 10th. And it's like, with all of this stuff with Amanita muscaria in history, you always have to leave stuff out in order to get it there. So like with Soma, you have to leave that out to get it, the Soma to be the Amanita muscaria. With the whole bullshit mushroom and Christian art thing, you have to ignore all of Christian history to get the mushroom and Christian art. The bullshit Santa Claus Amanita connection that isn't real, you have to ignore all of 19th and 20th century American culture in order to make that connection. So it's just for, anybody who cares about this kind of stuff, if you're interested in the truth of history, especially psychedelic history, if people have to leave things out in order to get some kind of psychoactive into the picture, they're probably full of shit.
A good rule of thumb. That's a good point. Yes, it can. I mean, this is more about meme creation than actually, exploring the problem and trying to figure out what's going on. We create these memes that are appealing. The connection between Santa Claus and Amanita is a good example. Santa Claus and the reindeer. I mean, I think there is a lot going on with Amanita and reindeer and Siberian shamanism.
There is absolutely no connection whatsoever. And I'm more than happy to lay out how historians know that for a fact. We are
right. I'm not saying to Santa Claus. I'm saying that there is a dynamic in the relationship in Siberian shamanism to reindeer and this sort of thing. And perhaps by watching reindeer eat mushrooms and then drinking the piss, they may have shown, but that it has a connection to Santa Claus, which I think was a much later thing, is probably not legitimate, but it's appealing, right? So one thing I did want to ask Chris, maybe, and I think probably Chris, that was going to be my next question. Where are you on the role of Paganum Harmala? Where does that fit into the Soma Hayoma complex, if at all? Either one of you, what's your?
Yeah, I thought Hayoma and Harmaline by Flaherty Schwartz is an excellent book, and I highly recommend it. And the material they dug up on medieval Gnosticism and stuff like that's unparalleled, And there's definite references to Syrian Rue and a lot of this later medieval stuff. Now, but they said that there was like no use of cannabis as a psychoactive until after the Islamic period. And that is like where their whole argument falls apart, because we now know this is patently false through numerous Indo-European finds. And they also argued that the Zoroastrian term out of the Indo-European language, bonga, was actually a reference to hembane or possibly Syrian rue. And that is, again, just like that's just their view, man. It doesn't hold up. The general view is that bonga is a reference to cannabis, and it fits with the modern term bong in India, and follows the rule of the an and sana in Sanskrit and these other chamvra in French, all these other Indo-European offsets, and it's long been accepted as that. So they had a radical view about cannabis not being used at all for psychoactive purposes, purely. Even the Vedic references like the Atharva Veda, where they talk about the plants under the kingdom of Soma, barley, cannabis, bonga, cannabis, and a couple of other plants. They said these were references to cannabis twine being used ritually as an amulet type of thing, and that all these references were purely to fiber cannabis. And that just doesn't hold up to scrutiny and doesn't hold up to the archaeological evidence. So that, in my opinion, is where their case for it falls apart. And I just don't, Harmaline has like little purple, little red berries and stuff on it and stuff like. There's nothing in the descriptions of Soma that fit with that, and it's very distinguished. So I don't think so, but I do think that ephedra was. I mean, Harmaline was used. Syrian rue was used in the medieval period for sure. I'm not so sure about ancient references.
And do you suspect that it was used in combination with some other DMT-containing plant? Because harmine, the beta-carbolines by themselves are not so psychoactive. So they're for the presumption that this is an ayahuasca analog of some kind.
Yeah. Like I'm not a fan of like the Benny Shannon theory that acacia and Syrian rue were used, like say for instance in the the Ark of the Covenant's indications of an ayahuasca brew. The acacia and the biblical references are to a hardwood, and that's pretty damn clear. And I don't see any. I've read Matthew Clark's book on Soma, and he argues for ayahuasca analogs. but he never has any clear case, just a lot of speculation and no like direct references to this name of this plant is this plant and the name of this plant is this plant. Nothing like that, just a lot of speculation combinations. And there's no doubt that many combinations were used as soma through the centuries.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's somewhat almost anachronistic. I mean, look, I know Danny Nemu wrote an article where he actually gets into the chemistry and the analogs and all that stuff. I'm not a chemist, so I couldn't possibly really comment on it. But if anyone is a chemist or interested in that, if you check out Danny Nemu's article in the Journal of Psychedelic Studies from, I think, 2019.
What is that article, Tom?
I don't remember. Getting High with the Most High is the name of it.
Okay.
Yeah. But I tried reading it and I'm not smart enough. I couldn't make heads and tails of the chemistry at all. So,
okay.
But I also, I just want to say real quick, that stuff, being completely ignorant of chemistry still strikes me as a stretch. It seems like this is the perfect historical anachronism. We all like ayahuasca today. So since we like ayahuasca, well, we want to make sure that the people who were, designing as ourselves in the past, because that's how people tend to think about history. They think of themselves in the past, not what the past was actually like. And so what we're trying to do is find, how were they using ayahuasca or some kind of ayahuasca analog? Well, the truth is they probably weren't. Same thing with the rites of Eleusis. We today like LSD. So we have this completely erroneous idea that they were drinking ergot-laced kykeon at the rites of Eleusis. There is literally not a shred of evidence for that. There is a shitload of evidence that they were actually drinking an opium drink. But see, today we have an opioid crisis in Western civilization. So we can't say that they were taking opium, because that doesn't jive with our modern sensibilities. Well, here's the deal. Ancient paradigms don't care about our modern sensibilities. We have to take each one of these cultures and place in time for what was actually available and how they actually thought about these things, and not try to throw, the ancient Romans were drinking ayahuasca. No, they weren't. No, they weren't.
Well,
and there is not, and I've studied old Rome, there's not a shred of evidence that they were drinking anything close to ayahuasca or like an analog or something like that. There's nothing.
Right.
There.
But I would, you're probably right about that, but I would gently disagree with you.
Please.
In the sense that, the idea of analog, ayahuasca analogs is not that far out.
Sure.
Because there are beta-carboline containing plants. They're actually not that rare. DMT containing plants are also, sometimes I say nature is drenched in DMT. There are thousands and thousands of species that contain DMT. So, and shamans are typically experimentalists, so the potential to develop ayahuasca analogs, that some of them may have stumbled on this from completely different botanical sources, is certainly possible. And you're all probably familiar with Jonathan Ott's book, a little book called Pan-Gaian Hallucinogens, where he actually, made several alternative ayahuasca analogs. So it's certainly possible to do it. And maybe it was discovered or not accidentally or not in some of these different traditions. That said, I accept what you're saying. There's not much evidence for it, that like Benny Shannon's talk about the acacia. What's missing there is the beta-carboline element.
Exactly.
And so it's tricky. It's tricky. And in the case of Paganum harmala, what's missing is the DMT component, which could have been any one of a number of grasses that occur in the Middle East, like Phalaris, like Arundodonax, these things. Fact is, nobody knows. I mean,
I think Danny,
something can be available and still not used.
Sure, absolutely.
Your brother wrote about that when he was visiting. I forget the name of the people, but they had psilocybe mushrooms growing nearby. They didn't even know what they were. I forget where the reference comes from, but it's like they had some other psychedelic that they were using. They didn't even realize they had this other one right there. So
No, well, I can tell you where it came from. I mean, it
please,
came
please.
from our trip to South America in 1971,
Mhm.
when we were looking for this obscure Witoto hallucinogen derived from Varroa species. And the Witoto were the, keepers of that knowledge. And that's why we went there in the first place. And then we got to La Chorrera and found that that the mission area where there was a pasture had been cleared. There was a pasture. There were mushrooms growing out of every cow pie, but it was like, to the Witoto people, just, it was not on their radar. I mean, they had no tradition around it.
Sure.
Maybe they dabbled in it. I don't know. They certainly did after we showed up. All the children. But one of the things was that when we got there, we found the mushrooms, and we thought, in some ways, we felt good because we were not stepping on anybody's tradition. At least not the Witoto. So yeah, that's where it was, and it was not. I don't know if they even suspected that these mushrooms, which were obviously a recent introduction, because it wasn't always pasture. That was probably within the last few decades that had been done, and then the cattle are brought in, and the mushrooms find their way there, as happens, I think, in every tropical pasture where you've got the cattle. So anyway, that's the origin of that story.
Yeah, thank you for clearing that up for me. So just real quick, to agree with you, I had mentioned all those unknown psychoactives of the ancient world, Geophyllus, hysteria. Maybe one of them was an ayahuasca ialog. So I potentially stand corrected.
Yeah.
I think that
there's a lot of ethnopharmacology left to be. Archaeoethnopharmacologists is what we need to sort this out.
Yeah, I think Danny Newman made a pretty good case for like 18th century ayahuasca analogs with Cagliostro and the Masonic scene around that. There's some very interesting reference to like extracting a crystal-like substance from acacia, and also indications of Syrian rue. So it's not like nowhere, you know what I mean? There is
right.
steps, I thought Newman's case was believable.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
I'd almost like to talk a little bit about ergot, Tom.
Sure.
To me, it seems like you might be the ones to take the rein on this conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, just about like medieval time and ergot. And
Sure. So ergot was used ceremonially. I part company with Master Bennett on this, but I think that Brian Marescu found great evidence for ergot use in an analog rite to Eleusis in Catalonia. There, I would say that I think there's good evidence for that. But Catalonia is not Eleusis. And with Eleusis, we have, the evidence for opium at Eleusis is completely overwhelming. And people that disagree with that, they don't know what the evidence actually is. And that's their own hang up. But they're just not familiar with it. As far as ergot was also used to teach people the secrets of witchcraft in some cases. In Finnmark, Norway, there was a guy named Lillenskold, who decided, this was in the 1600s, he wanted to catalog all the different witch trials that had happened since 1620. And I think he was right in 1684. And in a number of the cases, he says that, women were like putting this small black pellet at the bottom of glasses of milk to make people drink. And then they would learn the secrets of witchcraft after they drank this ergot infused milk. So that to me is pretty direct evidence, for ergot usage. But, the other things like cannabis are like, it's a lot safer, even mushrooms. I don't know if they were using mushrooms or not, but it's so much safer than ergot. Ergot really needs to be prepared properly and was used in medicine, but that was before we had, stable medicines. And of course, famously, that's what Albert Hofmann synthesized LSD out of, which is why we now all think that ergot was just all over the ancient pagan world, when it wasn't. I mean, it was used, but I think that cannabis and opium and mandrake were far more. I mean, the records, the evidence for cannabis, mandrake, and opium are overwhelming, whereas there isn't much at all for ergot. Things here and there, but not too much.
I want to point out, I thought Murarescu's Catalonia evidence was interesting, but I just have more questions about it. You know what I mean? They found evidence in a tooth and in between teeth and in the cup itself, and it was a very small cup, which seems very dose related, and it's intriguing evidence. It's like when you're finding ancient stuff like that, like the archaeological material recorded ergot, but we're never taking straight ergot. We're taking extracts of ergot, and so not all the biomarkers are in the extract that are in ergot. And I'm curious to see if there are biomarkers for ergot or biomarkers that would fit with a psychoactive extract of ergot. And we see this same sort of issue in relation to the Egyptian mummies, where they famously have claimed to find evidence of cocaine and tobacco, generally New World plants, right? And this would, how'd they get to the inside of these mummies? And they claim that the evidence of this is like biomarkers inside the mummies themselves, deep tissue analysis of biomarkers. And biomarkers are just parts of things that help you to identify things. It's not the whole plant. And so there's, I personally don't think there's a great case for the Egyptian mummies having tobacco and cocaine in them. I think it's probably embalming fluids and other things, and the things break down and chemical changes happen or something like that. And you get some of the same biomarkers that might indicate these substances, or it could be extinct plants from that time period. But it's not proof. You know what I mean? Like the resin on the altar in Israel, that's proof. The mummies in China with cannabis over top of them, that's proof. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's an interesting theory, and it may pan out, but I'd like to see more.
Yeah, let me just show something real quick. Can y'all see this on my screen?
Yeah.
Can you see that? Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Just for the people that are saying that ergot was used at Eleusis instead of opium, this is Persephone rising from the underworld holding opium, not ergot, opium. Okay, we literally have evidence for ergot, and we literally have evidence. And this isn't the only piece of evidence. There's also the Minoan poppy goddess that Demeter is based on. So please, enough with the ergot at Eleusis. You don't know what you're talking about. We have it carved in stone. We had certain people that were at the rites of Eleusis literally wrote like this whole idea that we don't know what was going on at Eleusis is horseshit. We have accounts. People wrote what was going on. You know what drug was said to be present there? Opium. Opium. We have a written account of opium being used at the rites of Eleusis. We have stone carvings of Persephone with opium. Enough with the ergot. It's just ridiculous. Sorry.
Well, since we're on the topic of ergot, I wonder, and it was mentioned previously, the connection to witchcraft. I think one of the reasons that women were stigmatized, vilified as witches is because they were obstetricians. They controlled the process of reproduction, and they probably used, or they may have used ergot in that sense, which are uses that it still has, to induce labor, to prevent postpartum hemorrhaging, these sorts of obstetric uses. That all started with ergot. Now we have better drugs for that, but that may be one reason why the women's were sort of stigmatized as witches, because they were herbalists basically, and they understood this most important part of human biology, which is reproduction. They had the levers on that. They could counsel women about having babies, how to do it or how not to do it, or how to have abortions, all very sensitive to the and taboo to the male patriots, the patriarchs that were running things. So I wonder if you have any thoughts on that witches, let's call them wise women herbalists, may have used ergot obstetrically. And it's certainly possible, it seems.
Oh, sure. Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm sure. I I don't want to make it sound like people were not using ergot at all, because they
Right.
clearly were. I'm just saying that we tend to throw ergot around in the past because, again, our own anachronisms. We like LSD, or at least I do. I'm sure
Right.
a lot of people in this room like LSD. So we want to see that in the past everywhere. There recent, like in the late 70s, there was a hypothesis about ergot having a role at the Salem witch trials. I wrote a whole chapter on this in my latest book. Ergot was not present at the Salem witch trials. It just wasn't. There's no evidence for it. So, you know.
But there were instances of ergotism
Oh, sure, but
in
that's not.
Massachusetts at that time.
Sure, but absolutely, but they all occurred after the Salem witch trials started. So one of the things with this stuff, and I agree with you, Dennis, that there are some reports of ergot, but there are no reports of ergotism at the beginning of the trials. If the Salem witch trials really started from ergotism, then that's where we would see evidence. We'd see it at the beginning, but there isn't any. And when you read the actual trial records, which I did pretty in-depthly, it's very clear that this was just a group of girls that were lying. I mean, that's really what we're talking about here. There were 12, 13-year-old girls with very fruitful imaginations, enjoying a coveted attention that they wouldn't have enjoyed at, any other time. I mean, girls were all throughout history, women have been completely overlooked. So, I mean, I think you guys just got the right to vote like a year or two ago, so it's like, it's ridiculous. But I'm just saying that it's more likely that these girls were acting out of the repression that I think we could all agree they were being repressed than actually having anything to do with ergot at all. I mean, it's just, and again, if somebody shows me like some record or something from that time period that demonstrates ergot, then I'll be like, oh yeah, shit, look, there it is. But it breaks the first criterion of historical detection, which is multiple contemporary attestation, of which there is none.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's important too. What you're talking about, Tom, is like kind of non-biased, looking at things from a way where we're not putting our own opinions or projections onto it.
Yeah,
because
it's my pushback against the post-fact world that I don't know if anybody knows this, but we are living in a post-fact world, and I'm tired of seeing it infiltrate psychedelia and psychedelic history. And it's like psychedelic history is sacred to me. If you can't tell by how worked up I get about this stuff, it's as sacred to me as the plants and fungi are themselves. So I just, for me, this has more to do with critical thinking actually than it does with anything else. And to just ask people to question the many dumb things that we all see on social media every day. Just because it jives with what you want to believe does not mean it's true. And I would just like to see, psychonauts, kind of take the lead on this and be like, hey, look, I'm not going to be fooled. My bias want me to believe this, but I'm not going to believe. Look, my biases want me to believe there are mushrooms in Christian art, but it's complete horseshit, so I don't believe it.
I do think there's a real lack of critical thinking out there in the scene.
Jerry Brown is doing an event with psychedelics today. Psychedelics today, up until 15 minutes ago, was a respected organization. The fact that they're doing something with Jerry Brown is, I gotta give Joe a call or something and talk to him, because put bullshit, like there's so much bullshit out there. Why do we have to poison psychedelic history too? Sorry for interrupting, Chris.
I think it's time for the discussion to get out of the psychedelic scene and into the scene of religious studies and religious history and medieval history and that type of thing. And that's where we need to go with it, because it's a crank fest out there. I've written a number of articles on psychedelic gospels, the secret drugs of Buddhism. And I've been pretty clear of where these things fall apart. And I'm sorry to people probably think I'm kind of negative, but this is how science becomes science. You know what I mean?
This is how you do science. This is how you do it.
Theories of evolution. And if we don't say why the other person's wrong and why we're right, we're never going to make any actual progress. And it's just going to be an endless bivouac of speculation.
Yeah, exactly.
one of the other problems is that I think it's pretty clear that psychedelics don't necessarily destroy the ego. I mean, you talk to people like, and you say something pretty, evidence-based, like there wasn't ergot at Eleusis, they were probably doing opium instead, and people go nuts because their egos are a little too inflated, and they like LSD, so they're answering history using their egos instead of the evidence.
Yeah, I think that's like, Dennis was talking about the mushroom theories for Soma. And a lot of times I think with Soma, there's like I have to be careful of this myself, of you like a certain thing, and so you're projecting its use back on it, but you have to be really careful of that, and listen to what other people say when they have criticisms, analyze it and be able to answer those criticisms. If you can't answer it, then you've got a hole in your theory. And I found with some of these other authors, I've directly pointed out holes in their theories that they've not been able to fill, and they just keep rowing their boat like there's no hole in it.
And especially with Jerry Brown, I mean, you and I have poked 1,000 holes in that guy's ridiculous ideas, and his only response is, Chris Bennett and Tom Hatsis misrepresent me. No, we don't. It's like, I don't have to misrepresent your bullshit theories in order to destroy them because they're that bad. So, whatever.
Well, I didn't want to name names like that, but
No, but that's the problem. And that's why this bullshit just keeps going, is because everybody's walking on eggshells. And it's getting to the point where, I don't know, it's like, do people really want to know about this stuff, or do they want to feel good and secure in their own egos? And what I'm finding out more and more is that people just want to feel good and secure in their own egos. And look, I would love for them to have been using ergot at Eleusis. There's no evidence. In fact, look, there's no evidence of them using any entheogen at Eleusis. I mean, if we want to get real, there's no evidence for anything there. The only question is, how did opium play into the rites? Because we have solid evidence that it did somehow. So, and that's if we want to get real talk.
Yeah, well, it's a good point for sure. Like, not to hate on anyone in particular, but I think we're all guilty of it to a certain extent.
Oh, sure.
It's like,
but you correct it. When you know you're wrong,
exactly.
You say, I was wrong. You correct it.
We need to stop getting so damn offended, and we need to take accountability. We need to take accountability for ourselves, and we need to be able to have discussions like this where we can be wrong, or we can hear new information, and not get so offended at everything. And I think it's not even just about psychedelics. It's kind of rampant in society. This is a little bit of a tangent, I suppose, but yeah, like there's just the internet. It's a beautiful thing. It's a tool, but anyone can post anything on there. And how many times have I fell for a meme that was just totally bogus, but it looks so real, right? And then you share it, and it's utter horseshit. Yeah, and other people see that, and yeah.
There's no filters for truth on the internet. This is the problem.
There's Chris Bennett and me.
Of course, well, in your own mind, perhaps, but sure. At least you have.
That's just my ego talking. Don't worry about it.
Right, I understand that. That's fine. I think, but that is a problem, Casey. But I think that's a different seminar here. But a good point. The social media environment certainly lends the truth a certain fluidity that that is sometimes quite dangerous, because and to Tom's point, I think that's exactly correct. People will listen to the story they want to hear. They're going to tell themselves the story that appeals to them for whatever reason, and it does not necessarily have to have any relationship to the facts. And that's very dangerous, because then that meme gets out there. Other people, even less critical and less analytical, pick that up. And pretty soon you've got a meme going that is, to use Tom's term, utter horseshit. And, there's a lot of it. There's a lot of it on the web these days, in case you haven't noticed. So this is a problem.
We could use the Latin if it'll make people more comfortable. We call it tutti sta core. Total horseshit.
Right.
Oh, geez.
But and so yeah, so if I seem a little animated or worked up about this, I apologize to everybody out there listening, but it is very frustrating if you actually care about the truth. If you don't care about truth, I'm sure I probably look like a maniac to you. But if you do care about the truth, please just, if you're out, just use critical thinking with this stuff, please. Because it makes it like when somebody says that there are mushrooms in Christian art and that person is taken seriously by psychonauts, it just makes the entire psychedelic research field look foolish to actual New Testament historians and medievalists and biblical scholars. We just look like idiots when we talk about this stuff. So since there are good areas, I mean, Chris, all three of us have written broadly about where there are psychedelics or entheogens or psychoactives, whatever we want to call them, in history, to maybe focus on that and just, we're in danger of becoming ancient aliens, right? How did they build the pyramids? Oh, the aliens did it. How did they, who invented the toilet? Oh, the aliens. No, people invented this stuff. And we're kind of doing that with psychedelics now. We're just, oh, this weird thing happened in the past. Oh, it must have been a psychedelic. No, maybe it was, but, we got to base things off evidence and, not just our own egos, which is, again, what a lot of this stuff is. It's just ego driven. People want to be right. Just tell a quick story, and I hope that it'll where I was completely wrong. So I used to believe, like, absolutely that there was a connection between Santa Claus and the Amanita muscaria. And it was my turn at Christmas dinner to ruin the night for my conservative uncle, right? We all have that Republican asshole uncle. Well, that was my turn to be like, ha ha, Santa Claus is a mushroom. And when I actually did the real research, and when I mean real research, I don't mean Googling my opinion or going to Wikipedia. I mean actually getting into the historical documents and reading them. I had to admit I was wrong and just say, shit, I'm sorry to my uncle. And that's something that I think we should all, it's an exercise we should all try every now and then. If you know you're wrong, go up to the person that you were, putting in their face and be like, hey man, I was wrong. That goes a long way, by the way. More healing than anything.
So true. Yeah, so true. It's so powerful, I think that's a big problem in our societies. We think we can know everything. We have a brain, so we must, we know it. But there's things that we don't know. And if we can admit we don't know, we can learn. And that's never a bad thing.
The greatest mind expander we all have available to us is being able to admit when we're wrong and changing our mind. That is mind expansion.
True enough. Tom, I'd like to ask you a question. Could you elaborate a little bit on, obviously you reject Jerry Brown's, total thesis. As a layman here and someone who is not a historian of drugs in the way that you guys are, but specifically, so you look at some of these images, and they certainly look like mushrooms. Some of these images that he shows, you say they're not. What are they?
Sure. Let me show you something I just picked up real fast, and I'm definitely going to answer that question. Can everybody, wait a minute, sorry. Can everybody see this image?
Not yet. Yes, now we can.
Yes.
Now you can. Meg Ryan talking to what's his name. This is from the movie called Armed and Dangerous with John Candy and Eugene Levy. It's one of my favorite movies as a kid. I used to watch it all the time. I recently watched it like 2 weeks ago, which is where this screen grab comes from, because I noticed, look at these trees. You see this?
Yeah.
Obviously, the director of this movie was part of the secret magic mushroom cult, because look at the way the trees are shaped. I would say, Dennis, in answer to your question, the best evidence that it's horseshit is that if you were to picture a tree in your mind and now draw an outline of that tree, it kind of has a bulbous top, right? And a long trunk. Well, that kind of looks like a mushroom. So trees kind of have that shape to them, right? Everybody here has seen a tree with its big bulbous top and its stem. Now there's that. Now, how we know they're not mushrooms? Because we actually know what a lot of them are. So the biggest mistake people make, specifically with the plain Coralt fresco, which again, admittedly, many years ago, I thought was a mushroom, but it's not. It's actually the design of this as well. Where this shape actually comes from on my screen share is called the Parasol of Victory, which was a very common, let me see if I can pull something up for you. Very common symbol in the ancient world, although it's not so common now, which is why we like mushrooms, so we want to see a mushroom. But people in the ancient world, the Parasol of Victory was, I mean, that was all over the place. And in my book that's coming out in like a year or so called The Mushroom Heretic, I go over this history. We have Latin words like umbrellicum, which means giant umbrella. We have no word that means giant mushroom in any ancient language. We also, and this is the biggest problem. So Jerry Brown and all these other guys, they say that there are hundreds of mushrooms in Christian art. And yet there is not one word in any text ever for 2,000 years. How do you have, does everybody understand the disconnect I'm talking about? There's 100 mushrooms in all these art pieces, but not one mention of somebody doing this? How? We have their art books. But nobody called these things mushrooms. They called them arbori, trees in the Latin. Like it just isn't there. When you look in history, it's just not there. Let me do something real fast for everybody. Hold on.
I've also got an article online, The Fungi Pareidolia of the Psychedelic Gospels, and I go through a variety of Jerry Brown's images and point out the mistakes, and also show that he purposely left out parts of images to make a case for his mushroom. So yeah, if you want a really in-depth thing on it, I've got like a 10,000 word article online you can find if you Google my name and Jerry Brown Psychedelic Gospels.
Sure.
Okay, yeah.
Wait, let me show you guys this real quick. So can you guys see this now?
Yes.
Okay, so that's the plain Coralt fresco, pretty famous, right, Dennis? You're familiar with this one?
Right.
Okay, so here's this is actually a chapter in my forthcoming book that you're all getting exclusive preview of. So you see this? That is the Parasol of Victory from ancient Assyria and ancient Babylon. Look familiar? It looks familiar because that is what the mushroom is. This is the shape the mushroom is based on. You can trace this in history. Look, here's one of the famous ones. This appears in Paul Stamets' Psilocybin Mushrooms of the World. This is one of the ones that Chris Bennett talks about in Jerry Brown's, his pace on it. You could still see, hold on, let me go back up. You see the nub at the top here, and you have the tassels hanging out the bottom. Does everybody see that?
Yeah.
Okay, you go down to this one that's supposedly a mushroom. It still has the nub at the top and the tassels hanging out the bottom. This is based off the Parasol of Victory. In fact, we have an old manuscript that describes these from the 1400s. Does it call them the mushroom trees? Nope. The tree-shaped umbrellas from the Ratisbon manuscript of, I believe, 1478. You go down a little bit more. Let's find some more.
Just to point out in regards to Jerry Brown's image there, he left something out in the previous panel to that same image. He says that image is Adam and Eve tripping and they're bent over tripping on mushrooms. But in the previous panel, there's another image. It's got the forbidden fruit, the apple tree, the serpent and Eve eating the apple. And then the next image, what he's showing there is actually them taking stuff off of a tree and making fig leaves to cover themselves with, the next event in the Genesis narrative. So it's not even an image of them eating anything. It's an image of them making a fig leaf thing to cover themselves. The image of them eating the apple is in the previous panel that Jerry Brown left out of that, as did Paul Stamets.
Yeah, there's something else I'd like to say about this. I've thought a lot about this, if you can't tell. So let me just finish up with the plain Coralt fresco. So people say this looks like an Amanita muscaria because it's been doctored. If you look at Giorgio Samarini's original untouched photographs, the tops are not red. I'd also like to point something else out. Have any of you ever seen an Amanita muscaria that has branches and other Amanita muscaria growing out the side? No, of course not. We've all seen trees that look that way. The shape it looks like that has to do with the Parasol of Victory, but there was one last thing that does need to be explained, and that's the white spots at the top. That is the one area where people say, well, how do you explain that? Oh, simply because I'm a medievalist, and ask any medievalist, they know the answer to this. This image actually comes from a medieval play. Okay, this is known as the paradisi balm, or the paradise tree. Today, people like to call it the Pilsen balm, which means mushroom tree, because they don't even know, this is how bad they are doing this. They don't even know that this tree already has a name from medieval history. So this clearly shows even Adam, right? This actually represents, this isn't the only fresco in Plain Coral Chapel. There were other frescoes which show the scourging of Jesus, the crucifixion, and the Pieta, which is the famous image of Jesus in Mary's arms after he's been killed. This all tells a story, the story of the radix apostatica, the root of apostasy. The entire idea behind this play, and again, we have scripts for this. The entire idea behind this play is that Jesus comes along as correcting Adam's original sin. This play was performed on the feast day of Adam and Eve. Okay, does anybody know when the feast day of Adam and Eve is? You do, you just know it as Christmas Eve. This play was performed on Christmas Eve. Now, this is important to where these spots come from. You see, part of this play included hanging communion wafers on the branches. That's what those white spots are. They're communion wafers. They're not mushrooms. Oh, excuse me. They're not amanita spots. Okay. The entire thing can be explained with natural, basic historical investigation. No conspiracies required. No leaps of faith. You don't need any of it. If you're doing real research, you can leave the bullshit behind. It's
also before Renaissance, artistic ability, like gone back to like almost Stone Age capabilities in Europe. It's just a lot of really poorly depicted art. And what Tom is saying about the parasol there, that really does go back into Buddhism as well. The parasol is a very, very, very sacred symbol of Buddhism. Google Buddha and parasol, and you'll get the whole story on the role that it has played for thousands of years. And this is where all this mushrooms in Buddhism is purely based on these parasol images incorporated into Buddhist imagery. Some of them are even modern images. You could ask the artist what he was trying to depict, and he'd tell you it's a parasol. Not to say that there wasn't drugs in Buddhism. There is clear evidence of drug use, datura, henbane, cannabis, and stuff like that in medieval Buddhist texts. The argument is that, well, those were known drugs. They were written about, and these are secret texts to begin with. They're like not like for wide circulation. They're tantric texts and things like that. The argument is that those were known texts, but the mushrooms were so secret they had to draw them into these pictures secretly. And that's the basis of it, because there's no references in the text that indicate these mushrooms, and they quite explicitly talk about cannabis and other substances.
I was just going to make that point. It's not just they don't, Chris, thank you for bringing that up. It's not just that they don't talk about mushrooms, it's that they talk about entheogenic experiences with cannabis, opium, mandrake, and henbane. Why would they leave out the mushroom? Real quick, this is what I was looking for. I am so sorry to keep bothering you guys with this, but we could destroy this right now. So I showed you the parasols of victory. This is the origin of the mushroom. Okay, from ancient Assyria and Babylon, it made its way, hold on, let me move this, onto Roman coinage. Everybody could see this, see the nub at the top, the tassels hanging out the bottom. Does anybody believe this is a mushroom? No, of course not, it's a parasol. From Rome, it made its way into, actually deeper into Rome. Here we could see clearly it's a parasol. On this one, you see, I forget who this represents, I apologize, but look at the guy carrying the parasol. Again, clearly not a mushroom. Go here from Rome. We are now in the Christian era. This is a very important piece. This is from a sacramentary of the 10th century. And here we see God is essentially, Jesus is crowning King Henry, right? That's happening here. And as it's being done, the angel is handing King Henry, what is this? The parasol of victory, complete with the nub at the top. Now it even has a cross on the top and the tassels hanging out the bottom. You could pull the same thing with medieval bestiaries. This is from a secular work. And yet, look, there's the nub at the top. There's the leaves. I mean, the tassels have now evolved into leaves. Here are, when people talk about the plain coral fresco and the mushroom sticking out the side, It's just these, they're just branches. It's just a style that people had. But again, if you're like Jerry Brown and don't know anything about Christian history or psychedelic history, you'll easily mistake these things. Point is, this is clearly not a mushroom, and its base, the plain crawford is based, I mean, you could see the pedigree. Come on, it's not a mushroom. So all that said, Dennis, I would say that those are the reasons, and I have about 1,000 more of why there are no mushrooms in Christian art. None.
Okay. I just want to point out
you.
too another image of Jerry's desktop. Okay, just got to minimize that. And okay, so this is the image that Jerry Brown used. Here's the people that he says have eaten mushrooms and tripping. But right above here, and this is in Stamets' book as well, here's Adam and Eve on the same panel. There's the apple.
We can't see
there's
it.
the tree.
Can't see
and
it.
the apple tree right there. Oh, you
Chris,
can't see it.
Share your screen, buddy.
Oh, I thought I did. Sorry, man. Here, I'll go back and.
You're good. Love
okay.
you.
Okay, just 1 second here. My apologies to everybody.
No problem.
We love you, Bennett. No worries.
Oh man, why am I?
I'm the villain of this conversation. You're fine.
Okay, I don't know. I lost my.
Good cop, bad cop.
I'm trying to get my control back here, but somehow I've done something that has lost my.
Well, while you're doing that, I'll just mention anyone in the Zoom rooms or on Facebook Live, if you have any questions, we're going to do a 30-minute question and answer period in about 8 minutes or so.
Yeah, cool. Oh, I'm looking forward to that. So
Does that show up?
oh yeah, there it is.
Yes.
Okay, so here's the image. This is the one that they say is they're ingested mushrooms and they're bent over tripping. But here's the actual image just above it. There's the apple tree on the right and the serpent with the apple in his mouth, Eve having the apple in her hand, passing it to Adam. This scene here is they discovered they were naked after eating the tree of knowledge, and they sewed fig leaves. And that's why this branch is broken off, not for a mushroom to ingest, but to cover her genitals.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'd also like to point out that Chris Bennett did us all a huge service where he actually got in touch with some of the people who Jerry Brown mentions in his book. And it turns out that Brown completely lied about what these people said. So there's also that problem. There's a big problem with honesty with that guy. So, and this is, I'm not misrepresenting him. Chris talked to the people that he misquotes in his book, and they said that they, to put it nicely, they remembered the conversation going a very different way than Jerry records it.
Well, this is all rather dismaying.
No, it's wonderful. We're getting closer to the truth.
Well, it sounds like in the dialogue there's a lot of investment in obscuring the truth. I mean, it's not like a collaboration of scholars trying to figure all this out. It's like everybody has their own axe to grind, and it's more like a promotion rather than a serious effort to sort this out. I mean, the evidence that you guys.
It's interesting you say that because
let him finish. Let him finish. Let him finish. Let him finish. Let him finish.
Well, that was essentially all I was going to say. It seems to me there's a lot of deliberate seeding of misinformation into this, and not really a sincere attempt to figure out what the hell all this really means. And it's in a forum where we're talking about ancient practice. It's very hard to nail it down, with reliable sources. So it's not helped when, you're deliberately, not you, but in this conversation, sources are deliberately misrepresented, and that's what seems to be going on. And that's disturbing. It should be disturbing to anyone that values, valid scholarship.
Why do you think I get so worked up about this? Because of how disturbing it is, Dennis. That's why I'm kind of on fire right now, because this is, we're at a crossroads here where we're either going to have legitimate research, or you're going to have the cranks like Bennett and me, or you're going to have the quacks like Jerry Brown, John Rush, and that idiot Jan Irvin. So it's
I want to point out that Jerry Brown, he actually accused R. Gordon Wasson of working for the Vatican in trying to hide the plain court mushroom from the people, and in trying to hide the Christian use of the mushroom. And he was referring to the work of Thomas Redlinger, who said, "No way, that's not anything that I indicated in my conversation whatsoever. It's a misinterpretation of it." And I talked to Redlinger about it, and that's in the article as well. So there is a definite, he's saying that Wasson was doing that, was deliberately misinforming people about the plain court mushroom to hide Christian mushroom use. But there's no basis for that.
Yeah. No.
Interesting. Well,
yeah, well, I guess there's some people who have some questions here in the chat. So let's take a look.
Do we have them? Oh, okay. Sorry.
So here's one from John Schultz. He says, what relevance does the history of psychoactive plant usage have for the problems we're facing today? Do you have a...
Yeah, absolutely. To answer it directly, the problem is that look, I like the internet, but it's allowing us to become very lazy thinkers. And I hope that by pointing out, hey, look at all this stuff that you believe, that doesn't matter, really. Look, whether Santa Claus is based on the Amanita Muscaria doesn't actually matter. My real point is, well, if you're being fooled by this, which is so easy to debunk, it's ridiculous, what are the really big things that are out there that you're being fooled by? That is the relevance it has.
I think that the plant-based shamanic use of drugs in the ancient world that's coming to light is as big a revelation as Darwin's theory of evolution was in comparison to the myths of Genesis and creation of Adam and Eve, because what it shows is the plant-based shamanic origins of religion itself, something these organized religions have battled all over the world, whether it be coming into the New World and destroying the shamanism in North America and South America or Africa or anywhere they went, or the witches in the medieval time. And that's the real revelation here, the plant-based shamanic origins of religion itself. And this is a very important role in the evolution of consciousness. And I think that Dennis's brother Terrence's greatest gift to the discussion of psychedelics is the combination of the theories from Julian Jaynes, Origins of Consciousness, and the breakdown of the bicameral mind with psychoactive substances, and showing how these roles played, these substances played a pivotal role in the development of consciousness itself. And we can see how the early people that were using these substances, when the fire in the brain acted the voice in the brain, that was heard as God, and now we experience that as thought.
right. Interesting, though, that James didn't anywhere mention psychoactive substances. I mean, that's the key. That's the main thing that's missing from this theory, which is very appealing. I agree, but how could he have overlooked that? Or did he just not? Did he just feel that if he brought that into the conversation, that would discredit him? Because I mean, that's the biggest hole, I think, in Julian Jaynes' theory. And there was no mention in the book of psychoactive substances or psychedelics, if I recall correctly.
I haven't read it.
I think there's a mention of laurel leaves chewing and stuff like that, but it's kind of just a vague thing in there. Nothing like what Terrence added to it. Yeah,
nothing like it would have been, because the shamanic experiences with psychedelics, they have this oracular quality, particularly psilocybin. So it's unfortunate Julian Jaynes did not even factor that into his discussion. I think it would have made it a lot more, a much stronger argument. But then I suppose it would have helped marginalize. Well, hell, it's marginal enough, But I think essentially he was right, But psychedelics had to have been, or most had to have been. That's committing the error that Tom rightly objects to. Let's say very likely was involved in these oracular experiences, and the you know, the essentially the gnosis that they were tapping into from the psychedelics, you know, expressed through these statues and that sort of thing. You know, it seems very likely it was pharmacologically aided in some way.
Yeah, I agree totally.
Yeah.
I think Arad, you know, the archaeology in Arad, Jerusalem proved that point. You know, it's like cannabis in a temple setting. The temple was like the size of a broom closet. So it would have been like a total hot box little area. But it's like clear they were burning cannabis inside an oracular temple. That was where the messages came through, you know?
Mm-hmm.
All right, we got another question?
Yeah, here's another one from Lee Ann Phelan. I think that's how you pronounce it. Can we talk about the ancient art that does show mushrooms? What do you think about that, Chris?
Ancient art that does show, like in, is this person referring to Mesoamerican art?
I think in both Mesoamerica and in ancient stuff like the cave painting with the mushrooms all over the
Tassili Cave,
all that type of stuff. I'm in agreement with that myself.
Oh yeah, me too.
Yeah,
and stuff out of Mexico, mushroom stones, all that type of stuff. I think that's really legit, strong research. I don't think every time that something looks like a mushroom, it's not a mushroom.
Mm-hmm.
I just think there are cases there for Buddhism and Christianity.
Yeah, let me also say that Giorgio Samarini, who I'd mentioned earlier, he has a great picture in, I believe it's southern France. It's called Mount Bego. There's an etching, a cave etching. It is, I know I've been saying like, hey, there's not Amanita Muscari in Christian art. This thing is clearly an Amanita Muscari. It's gorgeous. I mean, you cannot mistake it for anything else. So I think that in answer to the question, I think all three of us, Dennis, Chris, and I, are in accordance with that ancient, that particular style of mushroom art. But I don't want to speak for anybody else.
Yeah.
But.
No, I think that's a good point. I mean, you know, Chris rightly points out that there is a tendency to see mushrooms everywhere. Yes. You know, but sometimes they're mushrooms. You know, you can't dismiss it. I think that Tassili fresco, or however you'd like to characterize it, is one of those. And then there are also some very mushroom-like images in that cave in Spain. I think it's Pascual Cave. That's pretty clearly meant to depict a mushroom. Those things are not particularly ancient as these things go. I think they go back about 6,000 years. But there are mushrooms growing in that area right now that look very much like that. So occasionally they get it right, but there is this tendency to see mushrooms everywhere, and that's dangerous.
If I may, to just follow up with Tassili Cave, because there was something I noticed. I don't know if anyone's written about this yet, but with the Tassili Cave art, we tend to focus just on what's popularly called the bee shaman. I don't like to call it that because we don't really know what it was, but for ease, I'll call it the bee shaman. That actually appears, like when you go to Tassili Cave, there's actually there are different time periods of art. And all the stuff leading up to the bee shaman are all these little scrawls and scratches and stuff. As soon as you get the evidence for the mushroom use, suddenly the art is completely embellished. It is so much grander and larger. And now they're using different colors. And it's like you could just wait. When you look at it like at a timeline, you're like, wow, okay. No mushrooms, no mushrooms, no mushrooms. Holy shit, they're eating mushrooms now. I mean, it's right there. Another thing that one of the early, like just before the bee shaman, that you have images, again, these are scrawled, you know, like scrolls on the cave wall of the different cows and cattle and people on the ground behind the cattle as if picking something up from the cattle's droppings. I don't know if that's what they were doing, but I'm just saying, I think that that's pretty interesting that that is there as well.
Yeah,
and I think that should
agreed.
be
this sudden embellishment of the complexity of these paintings. It's almost as though the lights went on.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Triggered the imagination to start putting these things out. Yes, and there are some very interesting other panels there that show people. It looks like they're running along and they're waving these mushroom-shaped objects, and you can actually see, and then in the background they depict, what could be the visions that they're seeing. It's the one, the one I'm talking about.
I
It's
know
a very,
exactly.
very kinetic image.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think the tassili, as you call it, frescoes are, pretty indicative that that was about mushrooms. So yeah, for sure.
Yeah, this is another good question. Jason Woodrow, he says, do you know why the parasol was a symbol of victory?
Yeah, because in ancient Syrian Babylon, it was very, very, very hot, just like it is today, and it was a status symbol. We don't think of it as a status symbol because everybody has 3 umbrellas in their house. But at a time when people, your possessions consisted of a fishing pole, if you were lucky, then having something like a parasol, not just that, but having a slave hold it over your head was symbolic of power. And again, we have an entire history of this. Like it's traceable all the way up to the supposed mushrooms in Christian art, as I did earlier in this talk. I didn't even show you all the images or all of the text. It's very easy to trace. But sorry, to get to your question, that's what it was. It's a symbol of power. That's it. It would be like in 3,000 years, somebody finding a golden arch, right? The McDonald's M, and saying, what the fuck is this? Well, in their day, it was this big symbol and everybody recognized it. But maybe 3,000 years in the future, people are like, we don't know what the hell this thing is, because things change over time.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. Do you have any insight on the use of cannabis by the American founders? The American founders, George Washington. And additionally, is there any links to cannabis on psychedelics and Freemasonry? And that is by Joseph Galtzner.
Oh, we got to ask Petey Newman about the Freemason question. Too bad he's not in on this call, because he would be able to just school everybody on that one. Maybe Bennett has something to say on it?
Yeah. Like I talked a lot about Freemasonry and Liber 420, my last book. And there are these references in like Scottish Rites branches of Freemasonry to what's known as the bitter cup. And definitely in some cases, this isn't like mainstream masonry, it's like an offshoot of mainstream masonry, and it's under the Scottish Rites, it's referred to other names for it and stuff, the Rose Croix Freemasons. There's definite references to some sort of psychoactive cup of memory, it's called sometimes, and other substances. And there's also indications that cannabis was used, and opium, and in the Order Templar Orientis, which was an adoption of these sorts of rites, definitely there's explicit references to the bitter cup, as it was referred to then, containing opium or hashish, or in some cases mescaline with them. In regards to the founding fathers, it's like, it is one of the areas, I guess I kind of go off into the fringe and think that maybe because there was Masonic connections there. And it's interesting, in Washington's diary references, he uses the term Indian hemp as opposed to hemp. Now, Indian hemp was come up with by one of the members of the Royal Academy, Robert Hooke, to distinguish the fiber varieties of hemp that they were growing in Europe from the Indian varieties of hemp that they were finding in India that were psychoactive. So it was kind of a precursor to cannabis indica as a term, because it was initially meant to distinguish the psychoactive varieties of Indian hemp from the European hemp. And there's some interesting experimentation going on with cannabis at the Royal Society. There was at least 2 lectures given by Hooke. And Robert Boyle, he refers to the Egyptian electuary as well as fungus, referred to by the French author, used for seeing visions. So he's clearly talking about some sort of mushroom. I think he's referring to a reference in Rabelais to the agaric mushroom, but I don't know for sure what he means by the French author. But Washington uses this term, and he describes taking the males, pulling the males and leaving the females. And he uses the term Indian hemp, which is odd because hemp was the standard term at the time. Indian hemp was very specific in regards to Indian varieties. And through the connection to the masonry, and because of stuff I've mentioned in masonry as well, and I go into a lot more detail in Liber 420, I think there is a possibility that there was some sort of cannabis use besides industrial applications of hemp.
I would just answer that question by saying if George Washington was in fact using cannabis, he would have said something about it. No, we don't have. I agree with everything Chris just said as far as separating the male female. He wrote that in a letter. I investigated this during my undergrad. So
being a Freemason would be a reason not to talk about it. You're under obligations of secrecy. If he was a member of some sort of secret group and that was what they were using, then he does explicitly talk about Indian hemp a number of times. I'd like to see your explanation for the use of Indian hemp in that reference.
Sure, textiles. Textiles. That's what he's talking about.
No, hemp is textile. Indian hemp is a term for the Indian varieties.
But wait, hold on a second, because we're something's happening with language here. We have to take the terms not as we understand them today. We have to take them as they took them.
That's what I'm doing. Robert Hooke came up with the term Indian hemp at that time period. So that's what I'm doing. You're taking it.
No. You are using Indian hemp, which they used at that time. All I'm suggesting is there is a possibility that although they used that term, he might not have meant what we mean today. Just like, real quick, when Herodotus wrote that the Scythians, he uses the word hemp, but we know it was cannabis.
Yeah, no, hemp is just a word for cannabis at that time. This distinguishing factor between hemp and industrial hemp and marijuana is a modern thing. Indian hemp is referring to psychoactive cannabis. Hemp is referring to industrial cannabis.
All right, you and I are gonna
hemp versus Indian hemp, and the term was specifically designated to identify Indian hemp. And Washington elsewhere uses the singular hemp.
Awesome. It sounds like you and me are going to have to settle this over a little Indian hemp ourselves.
Maybe so.
This one's from Sidra Muneen. I think that's how you say it. Why would it be useful to a scholar to forge the link between mushrooms and Christian secular texts?
Could you
Tom or Chris?
What is the question?
So the question is, why would it be useful to a scholar to forge the link between mushrooms and Christian secular texts? Like, why would that be of interest, or why is that useful?
Because the people that say there are mushrooms in Christian art say that it only appears in Christian art. They say it does not appear in secular texts. When you could just look at any secular text, as I did before, like medieval bestiaries are filled with these kinds of trees, and they're secular texts.
I think any scholar wants to prove a theory. You know what I mean? It's what somebody likes mushrooms. They think, oh, that looks like a mushroom. And oh, here's another mushroom. Here's another mushroom. You know, it's like attractive. You know, people want to be right. It's like, would be a major, if somebody found proof of mushrooms in Christianity, that would be the find and discovery of a lifetime. There's no doubt about it. If it was solid proof, right? So there's a lot. Why do scholars study anything? You know what I mean? They're interested in a subject and they have a theory about it.
Mm-hmm.
No, never mind. Sure. Could you? Yeah. I had something just real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
Closest I've been able to come to actually showing a mushroom in a sort of Christian art. This is from my book, Psychedelic Mystery Traditions. It doesn't actually come from any piece of artwork per se. It comes from a medical text. It's from Santis Ardinis, Libra de Venenos, the Book of Poisons. And what I noticed about this text was that in each part where the author, we don't know who she was, it's anonymous, but whoever she was, when she was writing out some of the plants, she would use little embellishments that she doesn't use elsewhere. So for example, can you all see this entry for opium? See that?
Okay, I think.
See that? Everybody's okay. So you see that little bit of embellishment. Now, none of the other entries in this work have that embellishment. Okay, so there's opium. There's only one other fungal medicine, spoiler, that has an embellishment on it. And that is the one for mushrooms. You all see that? No?
Yeah, sort of.
I think I see. Yeah, I don't see the word fungus. I see Latin, I think. I'm not sure.
Oh, yeah, well, it's in Latin,
there it
it's
is.
fungus. Yeah.
Fungi.
But just you see the like these those like flowers and shit on this. I mean, this looks like a medieval hippie druid. Is the point I'm trying to make? If there are going to be mushrooms in Christian art, it's going to look more like that. I don't know if that's what the artist or the scribe intended, but that's probably as close as we're going to get if we're going to. I hope not, actually. Look, I would love for somebody to show me actual evidence of mushrooms in Christian art. I think that'd be really awesome. And again, I used to believe this myself. I've already demonstrated I'm flexible enough to change my mind, and all someone needs to do is show me one shred of evidence for this, and I will change my mind back to believing it.
Someone asks from Camille Miller, what about white lily and or blue lotus?
You'd have to talk to Arish Dedeen about that. I don't know much about blue lotus. Arish Dedeen is a colleague and a friend who is, I think she's probably the leading expert in the psychedelic renaissance on the blue lotus. So I would recommend talking to her. Yeah. I don't know, Dennis, if you know more about that.
No, I mean, all I know is that there was evidence that blue lotus and also white lotus were used in Egypt and also by the Mayans. William M. Bowden wrote about this way back in the day. And I mean, these things are not really psychedelic. They're psychoactive. They may well have been used, but I'm probably not the person to ask about this.
You know, I had a shop for like 20 years, the Urban Shaman, and I sold entheobotanicals, Amanita muscaria, blue lotus, all these types of things. So I probably have one of the people who's had more firsthand experiences reported to them than anybody. I never really been able to get much effect out of blue lotus myself. And in regards to Amanita, I've never really heard of anything beyond the effects that Dennis described as well, coming from numerous people that used it. And I did want to point out, you know, like that there is, like as Dennis noted, there is some more solid things. Like there is the Basilica in Aquila Aquileia. You know, those are definitely mushrooms, but then it's important to remember that at the same time, those are definitely snails, and other delicacies are depicted as well. And what's depicted is the Amanita caesarea, which is a gourmet mushroom. You know what I mean? There's not even any white dots on that basilica. So it's important to remember as well that this was a food and that a lot of people ate this food. You know what I mean? It's not always a psychoactive mushroom if a mushroom's depicted. Sometimes it's just a mushroom.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
This is another one. Ariel Rosenberg. What do you think is the biggest obstacle to the acceptance of the study of this area within mainstream academia and the world at large?
Bad research. Bad research is the biggest. So the thing that's awesome about academia is that if you can actually demonstrate your case, it will get accepted into the university. So, I mean, that's...
You know.
Well, but that said, university institutions and disciplines are often quite dogmatic and hidebound, you know, so it's not that, you know, if your idea is based in facts, and there's a lot of it that is, you know, there are indications, there are not definitive factual basis for some of these things, but academic, particularly archaeology, is a pretty conservative discipline, you know, and so you know, it's not necessarily true that, you know, if your facts speak strongly, it will be accepted. I mean, you know, archaeology is a very political institution.
I think the uninitiated, you know, don't perceive the truth sometimes, you know, like they'll mention something in passing, you know, a reference to cannabis. They won't even go into detail, or opium or something else, some other psychoactive substance. It just isn't, it's just not in their area of interest because they have no actual experience. The flip side's true as well. People project their experience back onto ancient texts and do that. But there's that, and there's also the pigeonholing of academic fields, you know, and sometimes you need a combination of knowledge to really understand this type of stuff. Some pharmacology, some archaeology, some history, you know what I mean? And there has been, you know, like definitely people like Professor Carl Rock, Dr. David Hillman, they have run up to academic opposition when they
Mhm.
start discussing some of these substances or trying to present theses.
Sure, but you would agree that Ruck's take on the mushroom in Christian art is completely bogus. So why would academics accept it?
Oh,
I would agree with you about Hillman.
Ruck's a respected classicist for good reason. You know, not every academic's theory is right, but it doesn't mean that, you know, he's written textbooks on ancient Greece and stuff like that. He's
Yeah,
very
none of that's been
knowledgeable.
disputed.
But
None of that's been
and he
disputed.
has made contributions to the field of entheogenic study. The term entheogeny was pivotal in the designation of the term itself. I don't agree with, you know, a lot of Carl's mushroom research, but he's well worth reading and understanding by anybody interested in the subject. And his you know, the ergot theory, whether you agree with it or not in regards to rhodoleusis, it was pretty radical at the time, and it opened up the discussion of entheogens. And, you know, although I disagree with Wasson on soma, you know, it's like there would be no field for us to be discussing this type of stuff without pioneers like that paved the way. Whether they were right all the time, I don't think so.
Oh yeah, of course, absolutely. I mean, we owe a debt of gratitude to all these people, especially Carl. I like Carl Ruck a lot. He was instrumental in when I was writing the Witches Ointment. I came across this this excellent reference to heretics having entheogenic experiences, and I was so like, am I translating this wrong? Is it really saying this? So I sent it to Carl. I was like, dude, I'm like, did I get this right? And he was like, holy shit, yeah, like this is, they're talking about using some kind of visionary entheogen. I mean, they literally, it's pretty remarkable. It's a great count. And it had been mistranslated since the 1970s. And this is one of the things that's important, where being able to read the language that you're researching in, because you could catch mistakes from biased researchers of the past. So for example, this one passage had been translated that these heretics were spreading this deadly poison. The verb, however, propinatum, which they translated as spreading, doesn't mean spreading. They messed up. He messed up the word propinatum with the word propago, like to propagate, to spread. The word propinatum means to drink in ceremony. So the passage actually says these heretics use a deadly poison that they drink in ceremony, not spread it, drink it. So I like Carl Ruck a lot.
Yeah, you know, I think that people like Tom, Dan Atrell, Carl Ruck are pivotal, because they can they can read these ancient languages. They read ancient Greek, ancient Latin, and that's where we have to look for these references. Tom was instrumental when I was writing Liber 420. We came across numerous alchemical texts in Latin. I was able to you know, get it down to that there's cannabis in these texts. Most of it was crap, but like there's 10% there where there's actual alchemical recipes and wine infusions and those types of things. Because of Tom's ability as a translator, we were able to translate into English for the first time in centuries and bring this information to light. And that's where we need to go with this. We need archaeologists, we need anthropologists, we need historians and religious experts of religious history, these types of people to get on board and start analyzing these types of things in context.
Yeah. Got another question? Oh no, this is my favorite part.
What the? This is by.
You're breaking up, Casey. I think we lost Casey.
But sure. Oh.
Hello?
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah, now we got you.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, that came from.
What's the question?
The question is, what about morning glory? So she's curious if any of you know much about morning glory in regards to ancient cultures.
Dennis?
Well, the only instance I know where morning glories were used was clearly in Mesoamerica, you know, where the morning glories, which were called Ololiuki, that was the Aztec word for it, and that applied to various morning glory species, particularly Revea, Corybosa, and some of the Ipomea species, which are, you know, your garden variety morning glory. And this, you know, from the history of of psychedelics, of the kind of modern history of psychedelics, these morning glories that were used supposedly were collected by Wasson and taken to Hoffman, who was already working on the psilocybe chemistry. And Hoffman isolated these lysergic acid amides from the morning glories. So in a sense, he thought that really brought it full circle in a certain sense, that he started out with LSD and then he found this natural source of LSD. So it definitely had both a medical use. It was used obstetrically. The morning glories were used much in the way ergot was, because these things can stimulate labor and that sort of thing, but also apparently entheogenically, ceremonially. Of course, there was no separation here. Women in labor were given morning glories to facilitate labor, but also to have a transcendent experience, hopefully while they did give birth. So that is a pretty well documented tradition in Mesoamerica. It's interesting though. I mean, just as an aside, the chemistry of the morning glories and the chemistry of ergot is not that dissimilar, in that the psychoactive lysergamides, the psychoactive ergolines in both morning glories and ergot are the same, LSA and ergonovine. These are the low molecular weight ones. In morning glories, you don't get the peptide ergots, the toxic vasoconstricting ergolines. So something that's puzzled me a bit about this use of ergot as a psychoactive. If you just munch up ergot, if you just chew up ergot, you're likely to regret it. I mean, it's a toxic fungus with these vasoconstrictive alkaloids. Now, it may be that a single exposure or two would not be harmful, but the whole basis of ergotism, of course, was that there was prolonged exposure because it got into the flour, the infected barley and other grains that were incorporated into flour. But it seems, and this is Ruck and Hoffman and Wasson kind of addressed this in The Road to Eleusis, that you could carry out a simple, essentially chemical partitioning of ergot. You could macerate it, and the low molecular weight, the psychoactive alkaloids are water soluble. The peptide alkaloids are not. So by simply macerating it in water and then filtering it, you could you could effectively detoxify it. They speculated on that, and I guess they tried it, but I don't think anybody, I mean, my question is, has anybody ever looked at this in a hands-on experimental way to try to get an entheogenic or psychedelic experience out of ergot sclerotia? I mean, I would think if anyone would have done it, it would have been Jonathan Ott, because he was very experimental. I don't know of anything that he did, if he did anything like that. And it may be he didn't do it because he was, he didn't want to kill himself. I mean, taking ergot could be a very dicey thing, without some kind of purification step.
I've looked, I've seen recipes, but I haven't seen anything where anybody's actually ingested anything. You know what I mean? Just suggestions of ways that you could do it, and I did take a good look, and I couldn't find any reference to anybody drinking an ergot infusion. I'd be surprised if somebody doesn't try it soon with the popularity of the Immortality Key.
Well, you can be sure that people are mucking around with this. Absolutely.
I do want to point out that we do have references to ergot infusions in Finnmark, Norway from the 1600s. That
okay.
we absolutely do have that.
That were taken for psychoactive purposes?
Well, specifically, it's written that, I mean, the person who wrote it, the guy named Lillenskold, who was the general, in charge, mayor kind of guy. I don't remember what the position was. But no, he said that what it was the visions that the women would have would teach them the secrets of witchcraft. So now, we would call that pretty psychedelic. They called it witchcraft. which
Right.
I mean, in my life, that's a lot of overlap actually. So
Right, right. It's hard to tell.
yeah,
Yeah, but that's interesting, But the LSAs, the lysergic acid amides, which you find in Morning Glory, you find the same thing in ergot. And Morning Glory Hawaiian wood rose is the best source. It has the highest levels of these things, and it's a nice psychedelic. I mean, it's not. It's hard to make the case that it can trigger the most transformative psychedelic experience of your life. It does not reliably induce a mystical experience of the level that psilocybin can, for instance. I mean, just in terms of phenomenologically, but who knows, maybe if you've never had a psychedelic experience, even the fairly mild experience you get from the LSAs is impressive.
yeah, I feel the same way about cannabis, mandrake, and opium in the ancient world.
Yeah.
I've got a quick question for you, Tom. I know we're like 2 minutes over, but perhaps it could be quick. About mandrake, was there some sort of myth attached to it with it like screaming coming out of the ground, or like what is that whole thing?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it was the few myths about mandrake. I mean, the popular one is just that you had to tie a dog to the mandrake, and because what would happen is, like, when you pulled up the mandrake, it would scream, and its scream was so loud it would kill you. So instead, it would kill your dog, which is kind of shitty. I think if anything, it would be better to attach humans to the mandrake to pull it out and leave the dogs alone, but that's just my opinion.
Hey, animals have been used in research for centuries. What's wrong with this? Just saying.
Well, I like dogs, so.
Me too.
But yeah, so there's that myth. There's also mandrake, I just remembered, was the oldest possible attempt to identify the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. In an old, I think it's a 5th century physiologist, which was the forerunner of the medieval bestiary, it says that elephants, that don't want to copulate, have to go to the Garden of Eden, where Eve and Adam would eat mandrake in order to copulate. So it's saying that was what the forbidden fruit was. I'm butchering the reference. I apologize, but that was the earliest one as far as mandrake lore is concerned. It was also said to expel demons, so it's kind of, let me just say, we have no direct reference of the historical Jesus using these things, but given that he was a healer living in the 1st century that excised demons, he was most likely familiar with not only mandrake, but I would also say cannabis, because he was a rabbi. And so he would have known the reference to cannabism, and probably opium, just from being alive at the time.
They have found evidence in 4th century AD, Bet Shemesh, Jerusalem, of topical cannabis preparations used in a woman giving birth. It was used topically and also burnt. And in this synoptic gospels, in the oldest, Mark, Jesus never baptizes anybody in the Bible, but he does give the apostles oil to cast out demons and heal the sick. But since we have, Dennis McKenna, he's one of the grand poobahs of psilocybin lore, I wanted to share something modern. This is an experiment I did in 1996 with mushroom and 12 individuals, an experiment in group consciousness. And that time I was practicing a lot of ceremonial magic. And I invited 12 friends out that were into mysticism and mushrooms out for a ritual I was planning. And I got them all to write out a question. And we did this ritual. And at the peak of the ritual, I touched one person. They were in a circle around me. That person was to say one word and follow with the next word. And I really think this is, in a way, the message of the mushroom, because no individual said this. There's 12 people, so you only had 1 in 12 words. The first question I asked, which I picked from the hat, was, are the forces of light going to triumph over the forces of evil? And the response that came back, it is not likely that we should see the way to understand freely and completely. That is, knowledge and power is left to one's discretion. If you seek to what I have given, then we shall know if everything will be forever best, together realize that we move towards an ever thrust to be in complete faith, harmony, and understanding, respect for us. So that was a that when they said that, it went from one person to one person. It was fast as a single person would speak. I had to race to write that down. And it's a complete paragraph with proper sentence structure that directly answers the question. And I've always felt since then that there was an element of group mind in it. And I'll read you one more of the questions. There was a few. And then the second question was, where on earth will be a safe place for humans to live into the future? How can we find appropriate place for living conditions on earth after events which breaking apart, which can't move to resolution, spinning comfortably? And I think what those answers say are, all the answers for the world problems we face today are out there, man. You know, and these mushrooms and cannabis, these other substances, they can alert us to some of that, but in the end, it's us and what we do with that knowledge that is really pivotal here. And I think that these substances right now, this is the pivotal moment, you know, either we're going to make it or break it over these types of substances.
Yeah, either the cracks like you and me are going to win or the quacks like the other guy. But just real quick, getting back to Casey, your question about mandrake. I just wanted to read something real fast. If anybody, if you ever hear about how Christians covered up their psychoactive use or anything like that, does anybody out there want to hear how a 12th century Christian describes the mystical use of mandrake as an entheogen? Because we have records of this. Okay, this comes from the Trudpeter Hohelied, which translates, this is Old German, but it translates to the Trudpert Song of Songs. The person writes, the bark of mandrake brings intoxication. This root denotes God. So the intoxication denotes God, the image of whom was Christ. On earth, he was a man, for he is a medicine and a security for eternal life. He is the root. The root's bark is the Holy Ghost. This means the numbing vapor, the psychoactive vapors, which make all lovers of Holy Christ tranquil. I don't want to hear that Christians covered up their psychoactive use. They wrote very openly about it, and there's a reason why we don't have anything like that for the holy mushroom. We have it for cannabis, mandrake, opium, henbane, nothing for the mushroom.
Interesting. Well, that was just fascinating. Time flies. Yeah, I don't want to go too far over time. I'm sure time could fly some more and it would be like 4 hours. And
I'll answer any questions anybody has. I'll stay for the next 3 hours if I need to. Just throwing that out.
Not that dedicated. Sorry.
Yeah, I got stuff to do.
It's my favorite part. Dude, I got to go run an open mic. Like, believe me. Like, so.
Right. It could go for 4 hours, but I've been doing Zoom all day, so
Yeah.
I'm burned out.
Sure.
yeah, well, yeah, I just want to say like thanks to you, Dennis, for being so generous with your time and patient and open with what you believe and what you studied. Thanks to Chris for, researching when things were a little bit taboo, so to speak. And Tom, you did the same thing. And we all clearly have similar values, similar things that we, believe in, even if we may not see eye to eye on everything. And yeah, thanks to everyone watching for taking the time to come here. And I put some links in the chat. I'll copy them to the Facebook one as well. Where you can buy some books and just know a little bit more about the speakers. Awesome. Yeah, I think we'll leave it on that.
Thank you, Casey. Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Dennis. Thanks, Tom.
Very lively discussion. All good. Thank you.
Is it cool if the four of us debrief real fast? Everyone hangs up just 1 minute at a time. Thank you. I know everyone's got to go, so just one. I got to go too. I got to go run an open mic, but just 1 minute of everyone's time, please. After everyone else hangs up.
Yeah, we'll just ask everyone else to leave. There we go.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay,
Is there a way to?
I'll stop.